How did I end up in this situation? I kept asking myself, why me? What did I do to deserve this? The honest answer was unsettling. It wasn't about what I had done, but what I hadn't done. Sound confusing? It did to me too. But now, drastic action was needed, and quickly, before things spiraled beyond repair. Let's go back a bit, and I'll try to explain. It all started when Veronica and I had a little too much to drink at a party. We were both 18 and at the start of the night, both virgins. By the next morning, neither of us could say that anymore. Somewhere along the way, Ronnie ended up with an uninvited guest in her womb. Of course, we didn't know this immediately. When we woke up together in the same bed, reality hit hard. Neither of us, in our usual sober state, had ever found the other attractive or even considered dating. Awkward words were exchanged before I made a hasty exit. Don't get me wrong, this wasn't about looks. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and Veronica and I simply never looked at each other that way. Veronica was just one of the girls in town, and there were plenty of others I was more interested in. As for Ronnie, she was part of a clique that acted like they were God's gift to humanity. Her crowd had an air of untouchable confidence, treating everyone else as if they existed to bask in their glory. My friends and I had figured out long ago that chasing the unattainable wasn't worth the effort. So, Veronica and her circle were never on our radar. But after that night, everything changed. It didn't take long for Ronnie's slim figure to disappear. I only started noticing her figure after a suspicious bump appeared on her stomach. Soon, questions began flying, and it wasn't long before suspicion landed squarely on me. Apparently, when Veronica told her parents about her situation, she made it clear I was the only potential father. Oh, how I wish I'd been a fly on the wall for that conversation. I doubted her parents viewed me as an ideal candidate for a son-in-law. I first learned about her pregnancy when I came home from work one evening to find my parents hosting Veronica and her parents in our living room. That's when things really got interesting. Veronica's father wasted no time threatening me with bodily harm if I didn't step up. He had a rather colorful way of putting it, promising I'd become a soprano singer forever if I didn't treat his daughter right. My mother was horrified, but my father, ever the old-school type, simply nodded and said, "You reap what you sow. A man takes responsibility for his actions." The end result, a shotgun wedding. The whole thing was decided without my input. The ceremony, the rented cottage where we'd live, and even the rules for our marriage. My sole contribution was to show up at the altar, say I do when prompted, and work myself to the bone to keep Veronica comfortable. Comfortable for her anyway. The cottage came with 2 single beds, and sex was off the table. At least for me. Veronica, pregnant and perpetually tired, spent most of her days at her mother's house. If I wanted a meal when I came home, I cooked it myself. I also cleaned, as Ronnie claimed she was too sick or too exhausted. It was clear to me this marriage wouldn't last. I figured once the baby was born, divorce would soon follow. At least then, the baby wouldn't carry the stigma of being born out of wedlock, which seemed to be everyone's main concern. But just as Veronica approached full term, life threw an unexpected curveball. It snowed, not just a light dusting. 8 inches of snow fell overnight, covering everything in sight. At 5 a.m., Veronica's water broke, nearly 2 weeks early. She screamed for me to call an ambulance. I grabbed the phone, but the line was dead. The snowstorm had taken it out. The nearest phone was half a mile away at the end of the road. I climbed out the window as the snowdrift blocked the front door and trudged through the snow to the phone booth. It didn't work either. That left me with 2 options. Walk another mile through the snow to a neighbor's house, where the phone likely wouldn't work either, or return to Veronica and try to deliver the baby myself. I chose the latter. Back at the house, I frantically searched for the home doctor, a book I'd seen on the shelf. Armed with the book in one hand and trembling nerves in the other, I became an impromptu midwife. I had no idea what I was doing, but for Veronica's sake and the baby's, I had to try. I had to act like I knew what I was doing. Look, I'm sure most of you have no idea what it's like to deal with a child with a disability, or even how to handle childbirth. Neither did I, at least not until I read that old book from 1905. Okay, maybe it wasn't quite that old, but it sure felt ancient. Still, the author clearly knew their stuff, going into painstaking detail. According to the book, the baby's head wasn't in the right position. Apparently, the little one hadn't gotten the memo on how to make a proper entrance into the world. After some delicate pushing, a lot of swearing, words I didn't think Veronica even knew, let alone used, and a fair share of panic, I suddenly found myself covered in all sorts of fluids I'll spare you the description of. Let's just say it was a messy affair. But there she was, a beautiful little girl. Thankfully, the umbilical cord was just long enough for me to place her into Veronica's arms. I quickly turned the page of the book to find out what to do next. If there's one thing I appreciate about those old medical guides, it's that they assumed you'd have nothing on hand. Modern books? They usually say, call the experts immediately. Well, experts were in short supply that day. Oh, and her name? Megan. Not my choice, I'll admit. I've always loved the name Otterly. It sounds unique and full of charm. But Veronica's mother, a.k.a. Dragon, is named Megan, so I was overruled long before the baby even arrived. After cleaning and bathing Megan, I placed her back into Veronica's arms. That's when things took another unexpected turn. 2 police officers climbed through the snow-blocked front door window. Before all this, I'd carved the word help in big letters into the snow outside. Apparently, an Army helicopter flying overhead spotted it, and a rescue mission was launched. Soon, a second helicopter arrived with a doctor on board. They quickly arranged for Veronica and Megan to be transported to the hospital. But there wasn't room for me on the chopper. As the crew loaded Megan and prepared to lift Veronica onto the stretcher, she asked them to stop. Gesturing for me to come closer, I leaned in, expecting a quiet word of thanks or reassurance. What I got instead was unexpected. Veronica wrapped her arms around me, pulling me close. Before I could react, her lips pressed against mine in a kiss that wasn't just tender. It was an all-out assault. Her tongue was halfway down my throat before I realized what was happening. I swear I nearly passed out from lack of oxygen. It wasn't what you'd call a typical moment of affection. I don't think any of the guys watching thought it was unusual. Just a loving wife showing her appreciation, right? But to me, it felt completely out of place. It was the first real kiss I'd gotten from Ronnie since the brief peck on our wedding day. Thank you, and I love you, she said softly as I staggered back from the stretcher, her words a mixture of gratitude and something deeper I couldn't quite place. A few seconds later, the helicopter door slammed shut, and it lifted into the air. I stood there for a moment, watching it disappear into the distance before heading back inside. The house was eerily quiet, save for the mess left behind in what I now jokingly referred to as Veronica's bedroom. Yes, you heard me, Veronica's bedroom. We hadn't shared one in months. As usual for our area, the snow didn't last long. By the next day, most of it had melted, and I was able to dig out the car. Getting to work was still impossible, but I figured I could make it to the hospital to visit my newborn daughter. Oh, and Veronica, my wife. Though, to be honest, I was more excited about the baby. The little performance Ronnie had put on for the police and military during the helicopter departure hadn't fooled me. When I arrived at the hospital room, the 4 proud grandparents were already there, gathered around the baby and fussing over her like she was the first child ever born. It was obvious I wasn't going to get much time with her, and as expected, the passive-aggressive comments started flying. "Why didn't you come last night?" they asked, as though trekking through snowdrifts hadn't been enough to keep me away. And, of course, you should have waited for the specialist to arrive, Dragon added with a sneer. Veronica wouldn't have torn her birth canal if you had. I tuned most of it out, as I'd learned to do with Dragon. Her words bounced off me now, like water off a well-waxed car. As I approached the bed, Ronnie reached out her hand. I hesitated but grabbed it anyway. That's what people in love do, right? Except Ronnie and I weren't in love. Not by a long shot. Still, she pulled me toward her with surprising force, nearly yanking me onto the bed. Her other hand caught the back of my head, and before I knew it, her lips were on mine again. I wasn't sure if she was kissing me or trying to choke me, but I couldn't help thinking, I could get used to this. When she finally let me breathe again, she smiled. Isn't she beautiful? She's got your nose. I staggered back, gasping for air. I don't know, Ronnie. Yesterday's kind of a blur. I was running around like a headless chicken. Ronnie turned to her mother. Mom, please give Otterly to her father. Dad, get your camera out again. I want pictures of John holding her and of the three of us together. Wait. Otterly? The name hit me like a brick. I hadn't realized until that moment that Veronica had actually gone with my name choice. Dragon shoved the baby into my arms. Yes, I said shoved. There's no other way to describe it. I looked down at the little bundle in my hands, feeling a strange mixture of pride and terror. Lucky she's so tiny, I murmured, more to myself than anyone else. I didn't drop the baby, but as far as I'm concerned, that's exactly what Dragon was aiming for. For a moment, I stopped paying attention to everything around me because my eyes were drawn to the little name tag wrapped around the baby's tiny wrist. It read, Otterly Christine Veronica Hope. Otterly was a name I had always wanted for my daughter, though Ronnie had once scoffed, over my dead body. Yet there it was. Christine was my mother's name and, coincidentally, Ronnie's grandmother's name. Later, I learned it was also Dragon's middle name. As for Veronica, of course, that was in honor of her mother. I glanced at Ronnie and saw her sitting up in bed, smiling at me. She gestured toward her father, who had shifted into full photographer mode, snapping his fingers as if he were David Bailey. Sit on the bed with Veronica, John, the old man commanded. I complied, more out of instinct than agreement. What followed was a mini photo shoot. We posed as loving parents usually do, though it was more for show than sentiment. I hadn't mentioned that Veronica's father was a professional photographer, not world-renowned or anything, just someone who specialized in portraits, weddings, and similar work. He knew his craft, and once he got started, you tended to follow his lead. After what felt like an eternity, the shoot was over, and Veronica turned to the grandparents. I want to talk to my husband alone for a while, she said, emphasizing the words my husband with a firmness that left no room for argument. As the grandparents filed out, I settled back into a chair, cradling Otterly in my arms. Veronica watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read before softly saying, John, put Otterly in her crib and come here, please. Her tone was unusually gentle, almost sweet, something I wasn't accustomed to hearing from her. Surprised but compliant, I placed Otterly in the crib and walked over to the bed. When I sat down on the edge, Ronnie reached out, pulling me closer until her head rested against my chest. Then, to my complete astonishment, she began to cry. I had half expected this. Between the Old Home Doctor book and the countless articles I'd read on childbirth and its aftermath, I knew postpartum emotions could run high. Tears and sudden mood swings were common, so I steeled myself for anything. Then, I realized she was speaking, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, she said, her words trembling with raw emotion. I've been such a pig toward you. It's not your fault. I could have said no at any time if I wanted to, but honestly, I didn't want to. Ronnie, what are you talking about? I asked. Puzzled, she suddenly sat up, her gaze locking onto mine with startling intensity. Wiped out, she replied. I accused you of getting me pregnant, but that was stupid. I wanted it that night as much as you did. The problem was, I couldn't figure out why, until my water broke. Then it hit me. I stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. John, none of the guys I knew could have done what you did last night. You were so calm, so in control, and you knew exactly what to do. I was terrified that Ottilie and I were going to die. But you were just John, doing what needed to be done and making me feel safe. Veronica, I may have looked calm, but most of the time, I was a mess, I admitted. She smiled softly and leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to my lips. I love you, John, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And when I heal, I'm going to blow your brains out. I blinked at her, trying to process what she just said. I'm sorry, but the doctor said it'll be a few weeks before we can, do it again. Veronica, please don't say that. I know that after having a baby, your hormones are all over the place. You're going to be emotional for a while until everything settles down. Let's see how you feel in a few weeks, okay? No, John, she said firmly. I'm in complete control of my emotions, and I know exactly what I'm doing. From now on, I'm going to be the best wife I can be to you. I sighed inwardly, recognizing that she truly believed what she was saying. From what I'd read, though, I knew it was best not to take any big declarations too seriously right now. It would take time for her body and mind to fully recover. Deciding to change the subject, I asked, So, did you rename the baby Ottilie? Yes, of course. That's what you wanted to name her, isn't it? Yeah, but you said you hated it. Don't you remember? I was being an expletive, John, and I'm sorry. I've always loved that name, ever since you first suggested it. I just blamed you for everything that happened. Before she could continue, the door opened and a doctor and 2 nurses entered. I thought I heard one of the nurses sending the grandparents to the waiting room, but I couldn't be sure. Ah, you must be the husband who delivered his own child. The doctor said as he walked in, From what your wife says, you did a great job. Thanks, Doc. But I just read it out of a book as I went along, I replied, feeling awkward. We could use a couple of copies of that book ourselves, he chuckled. Did it tell you how to stitch? Well, it did, but I chickened out, I admitted sheepishly. It doesn't matter. You did an excellent job under the circumstances. Excuse us for a moment. I need to check my work. I leaned in to give Veronica a quick kiss and left the room, following one of the nurses who was taking Ottilie to bathe and change her. I watched as the nurse prepared everything, and then on impulse, I asked, Mind if I help? It looks like fun. She grinned at me. Technically, it's against the rules, but who cares about the rules? You're the guy who delivered the baby himself. Helping bathe and dress Ottilie was more rewarding than I'd expected. It also had the added bonus of keeping me far away from my relatives. A welcome reprieve. When we brought Ottilie back to the room, my parents said their goodbyes and left almost immediately. Veronica's parents followed shortly after. Ronnie fed Ottilie, and I sat beside them, cradling my baby girl once she'd finished. When both mother and daughter fell asleep, I spoke briefly with the same nurse before heading out of the room to sort through everything that had happened. I tucked Ottilie in for the night and headed home. The nurse had been a nice girl, and I mentally made a note of her name. As for Veronica's sudden affection toward me, I was convinced it was more about hormones than real feelings. I figured it wouldn't be long before I found myself back in the women's market, as it were. Rumors about Ottilie's birth had already spread. On my way home, I stopped by the local pub to grab a bite, and as soon as I walked in, it seemed like everyone had decided the baby's head needed a good, thorough bath. I got completely drunk that night and ended up crashing at a friend's house. I spent the next few nights bouncing around at friends' places. I saw no point in going back to that lonely cottage. It wasn't until nearly a week later that Ronnie was allowed to bring Ottilie home. The whole time she was in the hospital, she kept up her little act of affection, and I, for the time being, played along. Honestly, I expected her to flip any day now, and I didn't want to be caught off guard. That first night home, Ronnie insisted that I sleep in the other bed in her room. She rambled some nonsense about being afraid she wouldn't wake up if Ottilie cried. The second day back home, Ronnie caught me completely off guard again. I walked in the door after work and immediately smelled steak frying. "I bought you a nice steak from the butcher today, John," she said. "It's medium rare, just the way you like it." It went on like that for the next week. Every night, I'd come home from work, and Ronnie would have some kind of dinner ready. Well, if she wanted to cook, who was I to object? At the end of the week, when Ronnie finally got out of the hospital, I came home one evening, and when I opened the garage door, I found I couldn't get the car inside. There were a couple of old beds leaning against the wall. "What's all this junk in the garage?" I asked Ronnie, walking inside. "The old beds from our room," she said casually. Veronica's offer to share the bed felt like an unexpected shift, something I hadn't anticipated after everything that had happened. I stood in the doorway, still holding the diapers, unsure of how to respond. The room felt heavy with the kind of unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. "Ronnie," I began, my voice shaky, "are you sure about this? After everything, the baby, the tension between us, I don't know what to say." She smiled a soft, almost vulnerable expression that reminded me of the girl I had once fallen in love with. "I know it's been hard, John, and I know I've pushed you away, but I don't want us to stay like this. I want us to find a way back, together, not just as parents, but as a couple. I miss you." Her words hung in the air between us. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, I wondered if this could be the beginning of a new chapter for us. She had been distant, caught up in the whirlwind of motherhood, and I had been so wrapped up in my own confusion and guilt that I hadn't truly considered how she might be feeling. Slowly, I walked over to the bed, my mind still racing. It was so easy to fall into old patterns, to retreat into the safe distance we had both created. But this felt different. This felt like an invitation, a chance to rebuild what we once had. I sat on the edge of the bed, glancing at her with a mix of hesitation and longing. I don't know what the future holds, Ronnie, but I'm willing to try for us, for our family. Her smile grew, and she reached out for my hand, pulling me gently beside her. As I lay down next to her, I realized that while the road ahead might not be easy, we were finally taking the first steps toward healing. And maybe that was enough for now. I sat there, stunned by what Ronnie had just revealed. All this time, I thought she was angry with me because of the night we had conceived Ottilie, and now it turned out that she was harboring feelings of regret about Billy Trunn. The truth of her past choices, and the way she viewed me in contrast to him, hit me harder than I expected. "Ronnie, I don't know what to say," I stammered, unsure of how to comfort her without making things worse. "I never knew you felt like that, about Billy or about what happened between us." She glanced at me, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I thought you would judge me, John. I was so messed up back then, and it seemed easier to go along with him, even if I hated everything about him. But it wasn't real. And when I woke up in bed with you, I realized what I had with him wasn't even close to what I felt for you. But by then, everything had changed and I couldn't take it back." Her voice was fragile, almost breaking, and I could feel the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. It was clear that she'd been carrying this burden for a long time, trying to make sense of the choices she'd made, all while trying to move forward. "Look, Ronnie," I said, my heart softening. "We all have our pasts, and they shape us, but they don't have to define us. What matters now is that we're here. We have Ottilie, and despite everything, we're still together, trying to figure it out." Ronnie let out a shaky breath, and her expression softened. I want to be better for you, for us. I don't want to keep hiding from the truth anymore. I'm sorry I pushed you away." I pulled her close, holding her tightly. "I'm sorry, too, for not seeing what you were going through. We both have our things to work through, but we can do it together, one step at a time." For a moment, we just sat there, wrapped in silence, the weight of our words settling between us. It was a long road ahead, but maybe, just maybe, we were finally on the right path. I wasn't sure how to respond at first, but all I could manage was a few stammered words. "Johnny, I was looking for you at that party the other night. I was drunk, and if I hadn't been, I probably wouldn't have had the courage to act on it. But it was you I had always wanted. When I saw you that night, I fully intended to sleep with you. Looking back, I think I fumbled my words, but I can't remember exactly. I'm sorry, John. Honestly, the first couple of times were awkward. I had this idea that you'd be more experienced, but I was a bit let down. But that third time, that was something else. I'm pretty sure that's when we conceived Otterly. But then you fell asleep, and when we woke up, I realized we hadn't been careful. You got up, left, and didn't call. I was hurt and upset, because I had built up this fantasy of you being my boyfriend, but then you just disappeared. Ronnie paused and seemed to reflect. Yeah, I know I hurt you. I was foolish, and I'm sorry. You're right about that morning. I acted terribly. The thing is, when I woke up, I realized I was pregnant. I was the one who led us into that situation, not you. I should have thought ahead, but I was too emotional and blamed you instead. I know I've made mistakes. Can you forgive me? I wasn't sure how to respond. You haven't exactly made it easy on me either, I said quietly, thinking back on everything that had happened since. I thought you didn't want us to get married and that I was just here out of some sense of obligation. Her eyes softened and she continued, but that day, when I yelled at you, I saw you for who you really are. Every time I looked at you, especially when you were with Otterly, I could see how much you loved me. And that's when I realized it. I'm crazy about you, John. Please, I hope you feel the same. And that was the moment I realized something that had been so clear all along. I was head over heels in love with Veronica. It had taken me a while to admit it, but there was no denying it now. 20 years and 3 kids later, we've never looked back. Sure, we've had our share of challenges, like any couple, but nothing that ever truly threatened us. And just in case Veronica starts channeling her mother, we have a safe word. All I have to do is say dragon, and she'll laugh, throw herself into my arms, and we'll end up laughing it off. It's become our little tradition, a way to end any disagreements. And with that, life keeps moving forward.